I'd like to introduce our plenary session speaker this morning. We have with us Professor Marc Fleurbet. He is professor in economics and humanistic studies and professor of public affairs at the University of Princeton. He has been an economist at the National Institute of Statistics and Economics at Paris, a professor of economics at the University of Cergy, Pontoise and Pau at France, and has been also a research director of the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. He has also been visiting professor at the London School of Economics, a research associate at the Center for Operations Research and Econometrics, University of Louvain, and a visiting researcher at Oxford University. He is a former editor of the Journal of Economics and Philosophy, and as of 2012, he is the coordinating editor of the journal Social Choice and Welfare. The reason why the scientific committee proposed Marc Fleurbet as one of the main speakers of this conference, apart from his outstanding curriculum, is his huge scientific production and expertise in topics very related to the theme of this conference. His research on normative and public economics and theories of distributive justice has focused in particular on the analysis of equality of opportunity and responsibility, sensitive egalitarianism, and on seeking solutions to the famous impossibilities of the social choice theory. We are very thankful for accepting our invitation and for proposing such an appealing title, very much in line with the theme of the conference, which is health policy through the social welfare lens. The theme of this conference has to do with trying to knock down the walls between health and other sectors like education, social services, income, and so on, but consider health as the objective of the society. So the objective is still maximizing health and distribute it in a fair way. Marc Fleurbet's presentation, and correct me if I'm wrong, goes a bit beyond that. It's something like saying that there is life beyond health. So his concern is welfare, not just health. If our topic is, or theme of the conference, it has to do with education, social care, income as inputs to improve the health state of the population, he doesn't treat education, social care, income as inputs, but as outputs as well. So as measures of welfare. So what I want to put this in on the table so that we can link the transversal approach that he wants to talk about with the objective of this conference. Many thanks for your accepting this invitation, and you have the word. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for this kind introduction.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Ignacio, for your kind introduction, and thank you, the committee, for inviting me. It's an honor and pleasure to share some thoughts with you. So indeed, I'd like to talk a bit about the connection between health and a broader perspective. What I'd like to address is three topics which will serve as examples of where this connection can happen. Socioeconomic health inequalities, inequalities of opportunities for health, and the issue of cost-benefit analysis and the introduction of fairness considerations there. So my talk will have three parts. I will first try to advocate that we need a social welfare criterion. When we think of these issues, we cannot just focus on narrower criteria. And then I will make some proposals about how to go about constructing a social welfare criterion, and try to argue that this is possible, unlike the received wisdom in our field in economics very often, where people think it's very hard, if not outright impossible. And finally, I'll give briefly some short illustrations of what kind of results we can have. So this is really a joint work, I should say. I have a long list of co-authors and colleagues with whom I've been working. So they are part of this talk in many ways. I won't exactly explain in details where they intervene, except that you'll see that Eric Skockert, who is here, will appear several times, and he will present a talk later this morning that is somehow connected to mine. So we have a bit of overlap. We try to coordinate. I hope it's okay, and you'll see. So let me start with my first part, which is about this advocacy. Why do we need a social welfare criteria? So let me focus on the first example, the first topic, which is socioeconomic health inequalities. As many of you know, I guess, this is very much about the correlation between socioeconomic status and health in the population. And one of the tools, I try not to be technical, but I'd like to be a bit specific on some issues. So one of the tools that has been popular in this field is the concentration curve and the concentration index. So the curve is a curve like this, where on the horizontal axis you rank people by increasing order of socioeconomic status, for instance, their income. And on the vertical axis, you add up, you put the cumulated health scores that they have. And so you get a curve that is not necessarily convex like that, but you see it will start below the 45-degree line if the people who have low SES, low socioeconomic status, also have lower health. And one of the issues, one of the criticisms that has been raised against this particular tool is that if you think of the degree of priority that this imposes in terms of the health distribution across socioeconomic status, you obtain something quite extreme. So let me zoom on the curve here. So if you focus on a particular small part of the curve here, so that's the part of the curve that you have. And here, suppose you have two people, two individuals. The first individual is here, and the other one has almost the same health, a little bit higher. Imagine, but they are ranked in this way because the one on the left has a lower socioeconomic status than the one on the right. Now imagine that you could bring the health of the second one, of the richer one, down to even 0, for instance. I wouldn't dare to say you should kill him, but suppose we would bring his health to a very, very low level. Then we would obtain a new curve. And if we could transfer his health to the other person who is on the left, so who is poorer in terms of socioeconomic status, we would obtain a new part of the curve which would be like that. And so we would have a curve that is above. And having a higher curve is considered to be a better thing. And the concentration index, which is computed on the basis of this curve, is proportional to the area between the 45-degree line and the curve. And the concentration index would go down, which would be a good thing. So that's, you see how extreme this approach is in terms of giving full priority to the low SES people in the distribution of health. And that means that this approach is not sensitive to the relative importance of health as opposed to other aspects of life, like socioeconomic status itself, right? Its absolute priority is very, very strong. I wanted to show you a few examples connected to the Spanish situation. I'm afraid you can't see the numbers here. This is a study that is looking at various regions of Spain and computed the concentration index for the health utility index. And a nice thing about the concentration index is that you can decompose when you have a regression of the health index on the health value on other things like income and other characteristics of the people. You can decompose the concentration index into the contribution of the concentration index of these various things. And if you look at the first column here is Andalusia, where we are. You see that the big contribution to this, so here you have the concentration index, the big contribution, which represents about 60% of the whole thing, comes from income. And in the case, the concentration index of income is actually just the Gini coefficient for income in that case. What is surprising is that you see very, very different situations in various regions. So this is an interesting tool, even though I criticize it, in terms of identifying surprising connections. So you have other regions, for instance, in Navarra, there is absolutely no contribution of income inequality to the concentration index. Other tools which have been popular in the field are the disparity indicators, for instance, where you compute the average health per SES group, per socioeconomic status group, with, of course, the need to standardize because different socioeconomic status groups may have different demographic characteristics like gender and age and so on. So there is a technical issue here. But the key, the bulk of the idea is to look at average outcome per SES groups. When you look at things like the risk of mortality, you would look at the relative risks of mortality across SES. Another interesting thing, instead of looking at the average, when you compare distributions across SES groups, you can look at the mean, which is just the central statistic of the thing. But you can also look at the whole distributions and look for stochastic dominance between these distributions. And so let me again give you a few examples. So this is something that is a study of the various, I forgot to put the reference here, but it's a study on the various European countries where you have an index of inequality which is computed. So this is really a ratio of average SES, average self-assessed health across socioeconomic groups, and where you see that Spain, which is circled here, is not faring too bad because the relative inequality is not too high compared to Europe. So Europe is the very last, the synthesis for Europe is the very last column here. Here is the reference that I forgot to put in the first slide, where you have the same thing when you look at the relative rates of death. And again, you see here you have Spain in various parts of the country. And again, you see that the situation doesn't look too bad. There is also another study which is interesting and looks at various age groups and various genders as well for cities in Spain. So if you look at Granada, for instance, you see that the relative rates of death are indeed quite showing a link with socioeconomic status for men. And for instance, for the low age group here, below 44 years, you have the average point, which is 3.6. Okay, so between socioeconomic groups, so it means that you have almost 4 times as much chance of dying in this age group if you are in a low SES as opposed to a high SES. A surprising thing is that for women, we don't see anything. For women, this socioeconomic status gap disappears for almost all cities, not everywhere. In Madrid, it's not the case, but in Granada, it is the case. And I was talking about the idea of looking at the stochastic dominance across distribution. So here is, I haven't found much on this, but I found this example looking at the Spanish situation again, where you have for 5 socioeconomic groups, and for the 2 genders, you have the self-assessed health, and you have the very poor health on the right here, and you go to very good health on the left here. And so you see that as you move along the socio-economic groups, the bottom is the worst group. You have really a stochastic dominance, so more people in poor health and so on, and less people in good health for all levels of health. My plea here, my argument is that all these data are very interesting, but why do they look interesting? They look interesting because we know that socioeconomic status is something important to people, and that health is also important, and so the connection between the two is the symptom of a problematic correlation between 2 advantages. So the poor are on the wrong side on both counts, and the rich are on the good side on both counts. The difficulty is that this is still a rough evaluation of the situation because it doesn't take account of the relative importance of health as opposed to socioeconomic advantage. And so if we were in a world in which people didn't care much about health, that would not be such a big deal. Or if they didn't care much about socioeconomic status, it would not be a big deal either, right? We should focus on whatever people care about. And we are interested in this because we feel that both are important. But the question is, how much are they important? And one complication is that it's not just whether the slope of importance, the relative importance of both, it's also the degree of complementarity and substitution between these 2 dimensions which may matter. So let me try to explain a little bit why this may matter. So suppose that you have on one axis, on the horizontal axis, for instance, you have one of the dimensions like health, and on the other you have socioeconomic advantage. Suppose that you have 4 possible situations here, very roughly describing where you can be in the distribution of health and socioeconomic advantage. If we have if these 2 goods are complements, so the lines I draw here are like indifference curves of people. Okay, so if it's like Leontief indifference curves, then if we imagine that people are spread everywhere, there is no correlation between these 2 things, then we have a situation in which, in fact, you have 3/4 of the population which is in the bottom indifference curve, and only 1/4 will be in the top indifference curve. Now imagine that you move from this situation of no correlation to a situation of perfect correlation, which should be bad if you think of this socioeconomic inequality analysis. Well, in fact, it turns out to be good in my example, because what happens when you do that, if you put everybody either, I mean, if you have 50% of the people at this point and 50% of the people here, then you end up with 50% of the people on the low indifference curve and 50% on the high indifference curve, which is an improvement because you have moved some people up compared to the previous situation. So you see, it may be important exactly not just how important are the dimensions, but also how complementary or substitutes they are. Of course, if you are looking at a situation in which they are perfect substitutes, then you obtain a completely different picture. In the no correlation case, so if everybody is spread on the 4 points equally, you have this distribution of situations where you have 50% of the people in the middle and 1/4 on either extreme. And if you move to a perfect correlation situation, what you do is bad actually, because you increase the inequality. Then you have nobody in the middle and everybody is on one of the 2 extremes. So that's clearly an increase in inequality. And so you see that the correlation may depend, how bad is the correlation may depend not just on the slope, but on the substitute complement thing. So my conclusion here is, in order to be more specific about how bad the correlation is, we would need something like a social welfare function, where we would have utility indexes or utility functions that would reflect people's preferences, the importance they give to these things, and that would give us a much more interesting picture of the badness of the correlation. Let me now move to the second example, the second topic of this talk, which is inequality of opportunity. So as some of you are familiar with this literature, the idea here is to distinguish in people's determinants of their situations, the circumstances and their efforts or preferences. And the difference between these 2 things is that the circumstances are things that people don't control, that they inherit from luck or from their parents or whatever. And so they should not, I mean, the inequalities due to circumstances are not legitimate. We would like to compensate for them, to neutralize them, whereas the inequalities due to effort or preferences are not so bad and potentially are just okay. And so the idea here is, in order to implement this approach, of course, we need not just to observe health, we need to observe the determinants of health, the factors that determine health. So in most applications, circumstances which are the groups of people having the same circumstances are often called the types of the people, and this terminology was introduced by John Romer. And so very often it's the parental socioeconomic status or their education level, sometimes their health status as well, when we look at health. And in the effort, measuring effort in this case is pretty hard, and there are many attempts in various ways. One proposal which has been made by John Romer is to look at people's rank in their type. So a type is your group of people having the same circumstances. How ranked are you in the distribution? What is your percentile, your position in the distribution? And that rank will be interpreted as the effort you make in reaching a good health, a good outcome level. And so again, what is often done in this context is to compare the average health or outcome, if it's another outcome, but the average health by type, and compare that across types. And again, very often standardization is needed here. As some of you may know, there is a distinction between the direct approach and the indirect approach. Let me briefly mention what that means. In the direct approach, you just look at the inequality of average health by type. Okay, so essentially you look at inequality between groups, between types, And you have the indirect approach, which is something where you start from total inequality of health across people, and then you deduct from that, you remove the inequality which is within types, and this inequality within types can be computed by looking at the whole distribution, where you divide the health of the people by the average value of their type. So when you do that, of course, after you have done this division, every type now has the same average health as any other type, because you have divided by the average value for this particular type. And so that's a way of measuring inequality within. So total inequality minus inequality within, that's another way of measuring inequality between. And the two approaches, people have tried to make them coincide and realize that that happens only if you have a particular index of inequality that you applied with this data, the mean log deviation. And very often people say, oh, that means we should take this index. I want to give a word of warning here. This index is very special in terms of the attention it gives to the various parts of the distribution. And that's something that it's a bit strange to constrain the index just on the basis of, and the attention you give to different parts of the distribution just on the basis of seeking consistency between the direct and the indirect approach. So that seems perhaps not so much a good idea. So I would like to argue that there is more flexibility than is often said. We can take other indexes, and if we have differences of results between direct and indirect approaches, that's not a big deal perhaps. Eric and I referred to Eric earlier, Eric and I, we have proposed a variant of this. Instead of computing the average health per type, you can do something which is taking, if you have a function that describes, I'm not sure you can see it easily here, if your health is a function of two kinds of variables, the C variables, the circumstances, and the E variables, the effort, what you can do is to compute for every individual the value of health he would have if his effort variable were at a reference level. So that's my E tilde here. That's what we call the direct unfairness. If you have a linear formula, if your f function is linear, that essentially boils down to computing the average value per type. So it's not so different. It's when the function is not linear that it's important to do that, perhaps, rather than computing the average health. It may make a difference. And there is an equivalent of the indirect approach, a little bit, not quite, but which is what we call the fairness gap, and which is written here. Let me skip the details. So let me give you one example of an analysis of this sort, which is done by Juzo and co-authors. And these are the various countries. I have circled Spain here in this figure. On the horizontal axis, you have a Gini index, of inequalities of opportunity. So what has been computed is a bit like the direct unfairness. So for every individual, they have done a regression of health on various determinants, and the circumstances in their analysis are parental education and parental health as measured by the age of death of the parents or whether they are still alive. So that gives you a value for every individual, and you can compute the Gini on this when you just focus on these. So you have the regression, you just focus on these variables, and you ignore the variables which are not circumstance variables. So that gives you a description of inequalities of opportunities in health. And on the vertical axis, they have just put the income inequalities, the Gini for income. And as you see here, Spain doesn't look as good as it looked before. We have a strong inequality on both counts. And so it's interesting, by the way, to look at this distribution of the various countries, and we see a positive relationship between the two things, which raises interesting connections between inequality of outcome, socioeconomic outcome, and inequality of opportunities in various fields. They have this group of authors, Juzo and Tranois and others. They have a group of series of papers looking at various countries, and they have done a very interesting analysis of these various things. Let me now try to come back to my argument in this talk, which is to say that this is pretty good, but perhaps not good enough. Because one issue again here is that we are not exactly measuring the importance of this for the people. But before talking about this particular problem, let me briefly mention some specific issues. One is that the circumstance variables which are important in measuring opportunities in this approach are not well observed, and we know that there are many things which people just inherit for instance, just their gene, okay, their DNA is something we do not yet observe easily. And this is something that presumably should be put in the things that people don't control and inherit, so it should be put in the circumstance variables. And so the fact that the circumstances are not all observed means that the inequalities of opportunities as measured here by the average outcome, the average health per type, will underestimate the inequalities of opportunity. Okay, so they will be underestimated. There are two authors, Nius and Peischel, who have proposed a way to estimate an upper bound, which is quite innovative. So we have this sort of lower bound in all the analyses that have been done with, we could say, the partial description of circumstances. But they have proposed an upper bound, which consists in doing a panel regression and putting the individual fixed effects in the circumstances. That captures probably too much, and they obtain an upper bound which is pretty high. So they obtain actually a lot of inequality of opportunity potentially by putting all the individual fixed effects in the circumstances. So we are still, the literature is still looking for a way of dealing with this imperfection of measurement. So circumstances are imperfectly measured. What about effort? Effort is something that is very hard to measure, and in a way it's just a sort of metaphysical notion. Philosophers scratch their heads about whether people really have free will. Do they control anything in their life? In economic models, we have no free will, in case you have not realized that. We have agents maximizing a given utility function under given constraints, so that doesn't represent free will at all. It's just automatons optimizing a given objective under given constraint. And so this is something that is a bit of a problem for this approach, but perhaps the usefulness of this approach is at least to help us understand the link between certain determinants of the outcome and the outcome itself. So it's an analysis of the partial influence. So it's a bit like the socioeconomic inequality analysis, but focusing on the different kinds of variables. Instead of the current socioeconomic status of the people, it's more things like the socioeconomic status of the parents or the education of the parents or things like that. So we are moving the target. We are looking at different variables, but again, we are looking at interesting correlations. There are issues about why take just the average per type. So implicitly, that means that if we look at the average, we are not interested in the inequalities within each type, each group of circumstances, which some authors in this field, including John Romer, consider a bit extreme. Perhaps we should take account of the inequalities to some extent, perhaps less so than between types, but still. And the final point I wanted to make is that if you look at the philosophical literature, it is actually an approach that is criticized. So people are a bit worried about this opportunity approach, which is putting personal responsibility at the forefront of the analysis, and effort, which is this sort of metaphysical notion. So if we want to base social policy on the basis of such metaphysics, it's a bit dangerous, and we can easily make mistakes. We can easily classify as undeserving people who are just handicapped by particular things we don't observe. And so this area of putting, dubbing people as being undeserving, whereas they are actually quite deserving, is something we should be worried about. And so my proposal is to say that we should be careful. It's interesting to look at the correlation between the association between variables of circumstances and health. But if we really are interested in personal responsibility, my proposal is to adopt another approach, which is just to say, it makes a lot of sense to respect people's preferences. People have different preferences, especially about lifestyle. Perhaps that we want to respect. Even though these preferences are partly inherited and all that, but still they may be to some extent respectable. And some people are more interested in health than others. Perhaps we should respect that. And if we respect that, we indeed will have some degree of personal responsibility in what happens to people, because if they want more of that, they will have it. If they want less of it, they will have it as well. So that's something that is perhaps a more promising approach if we are still interested in personal responsibility. But you see where I'm going. If you want to do that, to respect people's preferences, what's the tool for that? The tool for that is, well, representing people's preferences by utility functions and putting that in a social welfare function. So you are back to this idea that perhaps that's the real tool that we should use if we want to respect preferences. Let me now go to the third example in my talk, which is the cost-benefit analysis. So cost-benefit analysis is, as you know, is not popular in health. It's something that many practitioners and also health economists are afraid of, and not just health economists, but many economists. And so the implication is that in evaluation of health policy or health priorities, very often other tools have been used, and in particular, instead of willingness to pay, people have looked at quality-adjusted life years or similar measures, health utility indexes and all that. And cost-effectiveness analysis is used more than cost-benefit analysis. The problem, you know, is that when we do cost-effectiveness analysis, we know something about how to produce the most health with a given budget. We don't know how to spend on health, how much to spend. And we don't know whether we are actually, we are currently spending too much or too little. And so people realize that, of course, in the literature, and you have an interesting sequence in the literature, people moving away from cost-benefit analysis, looking at QALYs and cost-effectiveness analysis, and then realizing that if they want to say more, they have to go back to something like a willingness to pay, and they have looked at the willingness to pay for a QALY. So that seems like a detour, and the natural question to ask is, why not just look at willingness to pay, period, right, for whatever is at stake, rather than willingness to pay for a QALY, which is itself a sort of indirect summary of people's preferences over health. And so that's perhaps where I want to go. One more point is that we need a cost-benefit analysis to say something about how much we should spend on health versus other things like education or whatever. But even if you do just cost-effectiveness analysis, there is a difficult issue, which is the prioritizing of, the weighting of the various populations in the analysis. So very often people just add up QALYs for various people without paying attention what these people are. But it might make sense to give greater priority to people who are disadvantaged overall. And so if you want to do that, then you have to measure disadvantage. And for that, you need something like the same tools. You need something like utility functions and all that. So it's hard, even for cost-effectiveness analysis, I would say it's hard not to argue that we need something like utility functions. I just wanted to show you data that you probably know very well, better than I know them. But an analysis of health in various countries of the OECD shows that in Spain in the last year, so this compares the growth rate in per capita health expenditures in various countries, with the first period being 2000-2009 and the second period 2009-2012. So the crisis has already hit in the second period, and you see that Spain belongs to the group of countries where in the second period you had a decrease. And if you look, as you know, the decrease has been even stronger in the pharmaceutical expenditures than in global health expenditures. So that's again the same kind of picture for pharmaceutical expenditures. Also, Spain belongs to the group of countries where the out-of-pocket expenditures have increased, not as much as in other countries, but still. But then people say, well, but if we look at the situation in terms of health expenditure in GDP, Spain is still in the group of countries which is above the average of Europe, for instance. So we have Spain here at above 9%. And if you look at the health outcome measured by life expectancy at birth, well, Spain is doing great. There is no reason to worry about that, right? So that's the sort of discourse that we hear in, especially in popular press. What I wanted to stress here is that nowhere in these data, which are quite popular in the media, nowhere in these data do we hear about the population preferences. What do people want? Do they want more spending or do they want less spending? Perhaps the reduction in spending is good because people actually think we're spending too much, or perhaps it's bad because in fact people would like to continue spending more on health rather than on other things. So it's a bit strange that we ignore people's preferences. Let's imagine that we were doing the same sort of figure of graphs and figures for another thing that is actually a market good, like food. So we could do the same. We could look at the share of spending on food, and we could look at the outcome in terms of nutrition of the population. It would look a bit strange if we were talking about that without asking the question, but what do people want? Do they have the food they want, or do they want more? Is it something that we know that they freely choose to some extent? Of course, there are people who are very constrained and for whom it's very hard to go by. But still, preferences play a big role in the allocation of expenditures to food. So it would be very strange to talk about that without talking about preferences. And for some reason, because health is managed more centrally, we somehow get used to ignoring people's preferences on this very important part of their consumption. Let me come back a little bit on the reason why cost-benefit analysis is not popular in health. The main reason is that the way it is practiced consists in general in adding up willingness to pay measured in various ways, compensating or equivalent variations or things like that. But so it's just a simple addition over people, which means that a euro for a rich is counted as the same as a euro for a poor. And this is, of course, not very appealing. And especially, it's very easy doing this method to obtain results which are driven by the strong willingness to pay of the rich. They have stronger willingness to pay for the treatments of the diseases of the rich, and so we should, if we followed that, we should spend more on the research for such diseases, for instance, or the treatments for these diseases. So that seems problematic. So we don't want to give priority to the rich. We would like to give the opposite. And so that's probably the main reason why this is so unpopular, and including among economists. And in fact, for people like me who are more on the theory side, it's a bit of a puzzle, because this criticism that it is nonsensical to add up willingness to pay across people without checking their different situations is something that has been on and on. I mean, Kenneth Arrow in his PhD book, famous book that launched the theory of social choice, was very critical already. So that was in 1950, and many specialists of public choice and social choice have been just as critical, and still many practitioners continue to practice cost-benefit analysis in the same way. So why is that? Well, I guess the problem is that in order to do it right, theory says we should use something like a social welfare function. And with a social welfare function, what you obtain is that you can still do an addition of the willingness to pay, but you have to weight that. And the weights will come from the social welfare function. The weights will be the social marginal value of income for the various people. And that comes from the social welfare function. And the difficulty is that practitioners are afraid of constructing a social welfare function. And this is something that is considered to be value-laden, and because of that, essentially people either go away from cost-benefit analysis, which is what happened very much in the health field, or still practice it in the old way, which is still, for instance, very much the case in transportation departments. So that brings me to the second part of my talk, which will be shorter than the first part, which is how to construct a social welfare criterion. So I could go on and on this topic, but let me give you a brief outlook of how this could be done. Obviously, in order to do that, you need two ingredients, two tools. One is the utilities for the individuals, and the other is the aggregator, so the social welfare function, which will make a synthesis of the individual utilities. So I'll say very little about the social aggregator, the social welfare function. You can take a CES function, a constant elasticity of substitution function, where what is nice about it is that the coefficient of this corresponds to the degree of inequality aversion. So this function has been popular since Atkinson proposed it in the 70s. So that's something that can easily be used. I must confess, I'm guilty for having contributed to this literature on the aggregator, where we have found that, in fact, it's easy to defend the thesis that the best aggregator is the one that gives absolute priority to the worst off. So that's the Maximin criterion. And there are some arguments which have to do with respecting people's preferences, but also simplicity in the criterion itself. So not using too much information about people's preferences. So you may not like that because the Maximin is very extreme, and especially in the health field, if you think of the Maximin, you would spend everything on the very worst off people, which might seem perhaps unpalatable. So I wanted to mention that, but if you want to avoid this Maximin criterion, you can take a CES function with a non-extreme degree of inequality aversion. And you will not totally satisfy these criteria. So what you will not satisfy is some of these transfer conditions, the Pigou-Dalton transfer conditions, but you will still satisfy them in a weaker way. So it's not so bad after all. Just wanted to mention that is in passing. So let me spend more time on the construction of utilities rather than the social aggregator. For utilities, of course, I mean, of course. No, it's not of course. I should insist on the fact that it is a normative thing. You cannot evaluate people's situations without making normative choices. Whatever measure you take, this corresponds to some choices. This was the message of Lionel Robbins in his famous book on the economic methodology. He was misunderstood as being against interpersonal comparisons, but in fact he was not against at all. He was just trying to say this is not something where economists can impose their views. This is something that is ethical, and we have to be transparent about the ethical values which are put into this choice. One thing that I'd like to mention, and Eric in his talk I think will be even more precise about that, is that if you want to respect preferences, and that was one of my motivations earlier, right? If you want to respect preferences, that is something that implies a lot in your analysis, including for interpersonal comparison. So it's very easy to argue that if you look at two indifference curves in a space of consumption of any dimensions you want, and you have one indifference curve is everywhere above another indifference curve, it seems natural to say that the person who is on the higher indifference curve is better off than the person who is on the lower indifference curve. That's something that can be argued for, and it's clearly the case if these two indifference curves belong to the same person, because if you want to respect the preferences of this person, obviously he's better off when he's on the higher indifference curve. But I would argue this also counts, this also applies for the case in which the two curves belong to two different people. They might have even different other indifference curves, so they might have different preferences. They just happen to be on two indifference curves which don't cross. Now, I think we can argue for that, and again, I advertise Eric's presentation, which will be more precise and have more illustrations. But there is one important caveat, and I'm not sure Eric will mention it, so let me mention it here. You can argue for that, provided that you have enough dimensions in the analysis. If you just look at a small subset of the dimensions that people care about, it might be that the guy who is on the higher indifference curve is actually worse off in other dimensions which are not represented in your analysis. So you have perhaps to be careful. So this argument applies well only when we are comprehensive in the analysis of the various dimensions that determine well-being. And so once you have that, you see that this simple idea that the comparison of indifference curves can tell you a lot for interpersonal comparison, that the indifference curves, they just come from ordinal preferences. They don't come from utility numbers, right? Just the curves themselves. And so that tells you that ordinal preferences, purely ordinal preferences, can imply a lot in terms of interpersonal comparisons. And that excludes, for instance, using directly happiness data, because happiness data correspond to people putting numbers on these curves, but different people may put different numbers in different ways. So poor people may be more easily happy than rich people. And so you might have that the guy who is on the high curves gives a lower number to his own situation in terms of happiness than the guy who is on the low curve. So we have to be careful about using happiness data directly. This is a serious concern. Now, the easy case is when indifference curves don't cross. What happens when indifference curves cross? Then that we have a problem. And I think we cannot address this problem if we are looking at an abstract model. If we just say we have commodities or functionings, dimensions of well-being, and people have indifference curves in these dimensions, and we don't specify what they are, I don't think we can say much about the comparisons of crossing indifference curves. We need a more concrete model, and let me give an illustration with a model in which we have health opposed to income. And suppose these are the two main dimensions of life. And suppose you have these two individuals here. One is on the red indifference curve here. This is his situation, his bundle, health income bundle, and the other is here, right? And I'm assuming that the indifference curves are well-shaped. They have the usual shape. Health is between 0 and 1, so 1 is perfect health. And so it's hard to compare them. Who is better off, right? Their curves cross. It's not obvious at all who is better off in this case. So let me give you a recipe to make progress on this question. the recipe is the following. Suppose, first a preliminary point. If we move people's bundles along a curve, if they remain on the same curve, I would argue if we want to respect their preferences, we shouldn't change the evaluation of their situation. Because for themselves, they remain on the same curve. Nothing has changed. They are not better off or worse off. We should respect that. Okay? So let me keep the same curves and just move the bundles. So if I move the bundles there, so that's a situation in which now they have the same health, okay, and they have different incomes. So could we say, for instance, it would be perhaps tempting to say that the person, the red person who is, has a greater income is better off than the other person. That's perhaps not obvious actually. And what I want to argue is that it's not obvious because they have a bad health. So the fact that they have a bad health may trigger the concern that we should take account of their preferences over health. And here it is the case, by the way, that the person who has the better income is actually the person who cares more about health because he has a steeper indifference curve. And so because he cares more about health, perhaps that's a reason for concern. Perhaps this person is not necessarily better off. Now let me move the bundles to the other extreme of the situation where now they have both good health. Then I would say it seems intuitive, I won't make a strong argument for it, but it seems intuitive that in the case in which people are equally healthy and really healthy, then it's less important to take account of their health, of their preferences for health in the evaluation of their situation, because otherwise it would be a bit strange to say, oh yes, there is a guy here who has, for instance, the individual blue here, he has more income, but he cares slightly less about health, so perhaps he benefits less from the good health, so he's not so well off. So we would start, if we had a healthy population, we would start making transfers between people on the basis of how much they care about their good health. So that's something that is probably a bit strange and not so intuitive in how we think about health policy. And so if that's how we think, if we think in these terms, that means that in fact it's probably a good idea to declare that a person who has, when two people have good health and one has more income, he's actually better off, disregarding their preferences. So we can disregard preferences only when they have good health. When they have bad health, we should take account of their preferences. And so that gives you a measure of their situation, which we can call the healthy equivalent income. So just this level of income, which corresponds to the intercept of their indifference curve with the axis 1, is a measure, can be a measure, can give us a number that we can put on their indifference curve. And it respects indifference, it respects preferences, and in particular when indifference curves don't cross it, it gives you the right ranking of people's situations. Another way of looking at it is to say we could imagine that we give people the choice. We give them a flat budget, so they have a given level of income and they can choose the level of health they want. So if people really want to have more health, then they will choose all to have good health. So in a way that can make, if you think of other applications where people's preferences may not be monotonic, so for instance if you think of leisure, people might want a certain amount of leisure which is not extreme on either side. So in that case it enables you to have a reference value for this dimension like leisure or health that is endogenous to people's preferences. But let me just mention that in passing. So healthy equivalent income is a notion on which Eric again will come back in detail in his talk. It's a utility function. It represents people's preferences, and I argue it is fully interpersonally comparable and measurable. So it's a number. It's measured in euros or dollars or whatever. So you can do anything with it. You can put it in a social welfare function with any degree of inequality aversion. You can really use it as real numbers which are fully comparable. And what is nice about these utility indexes is that they incorporate people's preferences for health, especially when they are in bad health. So if you use this measure, someone who has a low healthy equivalent income can be at a low level for various reasons. He can be a poor person, low income, he can have a poor health, or he can have a mediocre health but care a lot about health. Okay, so you have three reasons potentially, preferences, economic situations, and health situation that can explain that. And so if you have a measure like that, I'd like to argue it's something that you can use to analyze inequality, and in particular to analyze the importance of the correlation between health and socioeconomic status. You can use it in cost-benefit analysis. It gives you these marginal social values of income for various people. So you can use, you obtain weights that you can put in front of willingness to pay when you do the addition of willingness to pay, and so on. You can also use it to do another thing that I haven't mentioned so far, which is to evaluate the trends in living standards of various countries or populations, and I'll give you an example of that. So that brings me to my third part, which will be even shorter. And so illustration of these various approaches. I have been working with Eric for quite some years now on a project where we have made a survey of people's preferences about health. Again, Eric will present the survey in much more detail. Eric, I hope you'll have a full house with so much advertising. And so the survey we've done asked people about their health situation and their economic situation in the past 12 months before the survey, and we asked them to consider an alternative situation where their health problems would have disappeared in the past month, and instead they would have had a lower level of expenditures. Okay, so good health, no health problem, but lower level of expenditure. So we asked them about what would be this amount of lower expenditure that would make them indifferent between the two scenarios, the actual scenario and the hypothetical scenario with good health. So you can imagine, I guess you see, the level we obtain in the second scenario is the healthy equivalent income of the people. And so with that, we can also estimate people's preferences. And so we obtain these indifference curves, which are, I mean, they are not, they may look a bit flat, but we start from 0.2 here in terms, we don't go to 0 because we had very few people in the survey who were below 0.2 in terms of health. So we don't really know what's going on when health becomes really terrible. And the willingness to, so we obtain a willingness to pay to be in good health with these curves, which is not negligible. Perhaps we have the impression it is a bit of a lower bound of people's true preferences, but we are not yet sure exactly what the best method to elicit preferences would be. I just wanted to illustrate a few things. So we have this paper where we have looked at the inequality in people's incomes and in people's equivalent incomes, okay, after we correct for their health problems. And here I'd like you to just look at these numbers if you can read them. So in the base situation, you have the inequality of equivalent incomes between people. And by the way, if you look at this value here, it is greater than the Gini that we have for income, which shows that something is happening due to the correlation between health and income. Not such a big deal, by the way. It's not a big increase in the Gini, and we changed the scale a little bit, so there is a rescaling happening, but still something is happening. So that shows part of the importance of the correlation between the two things. But what we've done in the following lines is to imagine hypothetical situations in which we would either equalize health across people and keep the rest equal, or, and including, I mean, and then using their preferences again to compute their equivalent income. So either we equalize health, and that's the second line here, or equalize their income and leave their health the same as in the base situation. And there what you see is quite striking. So the reduction of the Gini when we equalize health is significant but quite small, whereas the reduction of the Gini when we equalize income, leaving health as it is very strong. So that suggests that, at least with this data and with the preferences that we have estimated, the inequality in income is much more important than the inequality in health. Okay, but again, that if you trust the estimation of preferences, that's a key issue. The other example I wanted to give is a paper that is not yet ready, so but I wanted to share some preliminary results, which is about an applied cost-benefit analysis done on the anti-hypertensive treatments in using French data on the epidemiological impacts of these treatments. And so we have here we analyzed 3 treatments. So the first one is a placebo, so essentially nothing. And then we have 2 treatment strategies, and one, so strategy B is slightly less costly, but also slightly less effective in the long run. So the horizontal axis here are years. So we look at 10 years of of the evolution of the population, the target population. And the second strategy is a bit more costly and a bit more effective in the long run. So you have here the medical impacts in these two graphs of these various strategies. So you have the placebo here with the non-fatal events, and you have the non-fatal and fatal here, and you have the two other strategies. So you see the crossing of the curves corresponds to the fact that one strategy is more effective in the long run. We have the costs of these strategies over the years. So the placebo is less costly in the beginning, but becomes costly because of all the hospitalization costs and all that happens later. And the two strategies B and C, they have indeed the strategy C is consistently more costly, even taking into account the impact on lower hospitalization rates. Then, when we do the social welfare analysis, the impact on social welfare, so it's not exactly a sum of willingness to pay because we do it in a non-marginal way. So we just compute social welfare with different degrees of inequality aversion, and here the circled numbers are the degrees. So here it's a zero inequality aversion, so we just look at the sum of equivalent incomes, and here we have a degree of inequality aversion, a parameter of 3, which is a rather strong inequality aversion. So in fact, in both cases, we obtain that the less costly strategy dominates the other one for our measure. So again, it suggests that it's connected to the same estimation on preferences. The fact that people care not that much about health in our estimated preferences implies that the cost dimension is very important and seems to dominate in this applied analysis. Okay, we may not like the conclusion, but that's what comes from taking account of people's willingness to pay for the health benefits. And finally, some examples on the living standards, the trends in living standards that can be done with this approach. So you can compute, when you have equivalent income, you can integrate not just health but other things. So we have done with the OECD colleagues an analysis where we introduce longevity in the population, so life expectancy, and also the impact of unemployment on people's satisfaction. And we compute, we start from GDP and we correct for the impacts of these things. So we obtain an equivalent income corrected for these various dimensions. And what I wanted to show you is that this is interesting in terms of the evaluation of the business cycle, for instance. You can also use it to look at long-term growth. But here you have so the yellow curve here is the Spanish curve. And so I have constructed here next to it the curve for the GDP. So you see that the curve for GDP, so this is between 2000 and 2012. The curve for GDP goes down with the crisis somewhat, but the curve of the corrected GDP goes down much more dramatically, and that incorporates the impact of unemployment, and also, I'm not sure because this is still preliminary, I think there is also an impact of inequalities. We incorporate an element of inequalities in the analysis, and it's probably partly due to that as well. And you see that the curve for Greece also is very dramatic. So that's something that may be interesting. So the way in which preferences are estimated here is different. It's not on the basis of a survey with stated preferences. It's on the basis of a regression of satisfaction surveys on people's objective situations. Yeah, so let me skip that perhaps and move to my conclusion. So what I've tried to argue is that a social welfare function framework is useful for the analysis of inequalities, and in particular tells us something about whether socioeconomic inequalities and their correlation with health matter or not. It can be used for cost-benefit analysis because then you can tell something about whether we spend too much or too little on health. I wish I would be able to say something about that, especially for Spain, but also for France. We have done our survey in France. We are not yet there for a simple reason. It's very hard to have, so willingness to pay for health is one thing, but another thing that is very hard is to know the productivity, the production function of health, and the impact of health spending on the health outcomes, and that is actually the sort of obstacle that we have to get rid of in order to reach conclusions on this question about whether we should spend more or less on health. And the third application, as I've just shown, is living standards, and it's beyond GDP story. So in terms of conceptual argument, my main point was that interpersonal comparisons are possible. We shouldn't be so afraid of them, even though they are based on value judgments, and we have to be comfortable with that. And so the main point I'd like to make in terms of methods here is that our role as experts is not to impose the value judgments on the policymakers, for instance, but at least to make explicit what the consequences of value judgments are on the policy conclusions. So, for instance, when we do cost-benefit analysis, we have this parameter of inequality aversion, which is hard to choose for the policymaker, but we can give a menu of results and say, if you have a strong inequality aversion, you will have this conclusion. If you have a weak inequality aversion, you may have a different conclusion. We can offer a menu, but if we don't offer the menu, I don't think we should believe that the policymaker will be able to construct the analysis. Only the expert is able to provide the ingredients. And this quote by Samuelson is sort of a nice legitimation of this approach, that we shouldn't be afraid of being economists, and also to look at values and the consequences of value judgments. Thank you so much for your attention. This is, if you want to read further some advertising, it's a kind of private joke, so the names of Eric is in red because that's an advertising for his next tour.
Okay, thanks Mark for this extremely interesting presentation. Tenemos tiempo para hacer algunas preguntas o comentarios, 15 minutos, 20 minutos casi. Tiene la palabra quien quiera hablar. Les rogaría que dijesen quién son o quién es y su afiliación también. Tenemos un micrófono preparado, ¿eh? Ahí al fondo, sí.
Hello, I'm David Epstein from Granada, and thank you for the talk. Very interesting. I wanted to ask you a bit more about cost-benefit analysis, and just some of the advantages and disadvantages of the cost-benefit approach versus the kind of quali approach. And just to put maybe a comment, so perhaps one reason why the quali approach is popular is not actually because of its better theoretical properties, but just because it's very easy to implement. You can, just with information about health and a bit of modelling, you can quite easily calculate qualies or model qualies or simulate qualies. Whereas I think for the social welfare function and the willingness to pay, you need quite detailed information about people's trade-offs, sort of within, and it's very study specific. So, if that's right, if I've understood right.
Yes, I think you're right. But we may try to make the work easier for people who want to use the social welfare function approach. So if you think, for instance, of the cost-benefit analysis, when it relies on willingness to pay, what can be done is to construct the weights once and for all, so to speak. So we can have a sort of national survey that will try to evaluate people's preferences and the distribution of their situations. And then we can produce tables that give you the weights that should be used for different kinds of people. Of course, when you do a particular analysis, you still need to elicit people's willingness to pay for whatever health program or treatment you want to consider. So that remains to be done. And it may be considered a bit harder than applying given quali numbers to health outcomes. But you wouldn't need to do the hard work of estimating the whole preferences of the people and of computing the weight. So that could be done somehow in a centralized way once, I mean not once and for all, but every 5 years or something like that. And then you would have the table of weights, which could be a sort of central tool that everybody could use. But the other thing I wanted to say is that the QALYs are deceptively simple because, as you know, they are based on people's preferences. So they are supposed to represent preferences. And the fact that the numbers are usually used as given is just because people want to save on their effort, right? But if you wanted to really respect the population, the target population's preferences, we should recompute the QALYs for every different population. And very often the QALYs that are used come from a population that is extremely, I mean, that's quite far away from the target population that we are considering. Sometimes it's a population of health professionals or things like that. So for instance, in the WHO computation of DALYs. It's not clear that the simplicity comes from the concept itself. It comes also from the practice that people get used to taking numbers which may not be exactly what they should be using if they want to respect the target population's preferences. So if we wanted to do it right on both cases, the degree of complexity would probably be much more comparable. We would have to recompute the QALYs for every different target population. That would also be somewhat demanding.
Hay dos palabras pedidas.
Yes, Joan Rovira, University of Barcelona. I wanted to ask you, you clearly are more welfarist than extra welfarist if we look at these two positions in economic evaluation. So my question would be, could you say something about what is the most appropriate type of variable on which ask people to assess the willingness to pay? Because you can ask to assess the willingness to pay on health outcomes, or on a level of health, or on an increase of health, or on some services, or on some intermediate, I don't know, reduction of cholesterol or whatever. No. So could you say something about your views on what is and what about, for instance, process utility? Should this be also considered, and how can we go on with all these question marks?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a fully fledged answer to it. So the one thought about it is that it's probably, the background issues here are whether we can trust people's views and preferences, and on what parts of their life can we trust them most. And so it might be the case that we can trust them more on purely personal outcomes rather than on things which are farther away from them. So as you know, for instance, contingent valuation studies on environmental issues are not very reliable because people can't make the difference between saving one species and saving 200 species. So it's something that is a bit problematic. So I guess it's the same in health policy. If we ask them about a particular health reform directly, they will bring in their political views. They will bring in many things that may blur the analysis. So it's probably the first answer would be it's probably safer to try to look at their outcomes, their personal outcomes, and just trust their views or respect their views on these purely personal things. That of course makes the analysis complicated in some cases, because when we want to do cost-benefit analysis, sometimes it looks simpler if we could just elicit people's willingness to pay for a program rather than for the impact of the program on their health situation. But that might be the cost to pay in order to have results which are more reliable, more robust. That being said, so that's the first part of my answer. The second part is that I'm not so sure that the answer is just that, because you were referring to process utility, and I think that's an important thing. People may care about things which are not their purely personal situation. They also care about the political environment and the way, the processes in which they are involved. And so the question is, where do we put the boundary between what we should put in their utility and what we should consider to be political views which are not relevant for the analysis. So I'm not quite sure where the boundary should be. I've been struggling with that for quite some time, and actually Eric, who is here, really on good, that's a good occasion, because we have been talking about that for years, and he has convinced me that I was wrong for a long time. I thought that we should really be quite conservative and think, I mean, in terms of intellectual conservatism, try to think in terms of really the narrow perspective on well-being. So Amartya Sen, for instance, makes this big difference between well-being and agency. And so well-being should be something that is really personal and not have much to do with the environment and the political process. That's perhaps not so convincing. And what convinced me in my conversation with Eric was the difficulty to make a distinction between people's preferences for public goods, like the quality of the natural environment, and their preferences for the quality of the institutional environment. What's the difference between these two things? It's not clear at all. So if we want to incorporate people's preferences for the natural environment in the analysis of their situation, why not put their preferences for the institutional environment as well? And so, yeah, so that's not a full answer. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure where to put the boundary, but probably we should be flexible about putting some of these preferences over the processes in the analysis.
Hay una palabra pedida por aquí.
Alois Stutzer, University of Basel. I would like to ask a question with regard to your concept of healthy equivalent income. And if I understood you correctly, this relies on observed behavior, this concept, as we have many. So, however, people often face self-control problems when they have to decide about investments in health. So at least we argue in this direction when we observe about obesity. So what would be your recommendation? How should we deal with this issue when we would like to pursue this concept of healthy equivalent income? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's really a great question, and thank you, because that gives me the occasion to clarify a bit. And Eric will be more specific about the various sources of information. So perhaps Eric should answer the questions here. So there are various sources of information about people's preferences that enable us to compute equivalent incomes. So one source of information is behavior, but that's just one source, and it may be the least reliable source for the reasons you said, that people's behavior, especially in issues having to do with time and risk and health, people's behavior may be driven by things which are not their true, their authentic preferences. And so there are other sources. So in the two examples I gave of applications at the end, it was actually other sources that were used. So we had this survey where we relied on stated preferences. So that was not people's behavior. It was really asking them to look back at the year before the survey and comparing two scenarios and identifying the scenario that with good health would make them indifferent with their actual situation. So that was really stated preferences, a bit like contingent valuation, but not on saving species over the world, but their personal situation. And the other source of information is happiness studies, actually, of which you are a specialist. And so, as you know, some analysis in terms of cost-benefit analysis based on that is done, and that relies on estimating people's willingness to pay on the basis of this data. So you can use this data with precautions, of course, there are issues, but to try to estimate people's preferences, the weights they put on various determinants of their satisfaction. And that's another source that can be worth using. One key issue, indeed, behavioral economics is telling us that people's preferences, especially as they are reflected in their behavior, are not consistent, not reliable. They can be framed very easily, including for important decisions like retirement, in pension plans and things like that. So I guess if you look at the philosophical literature or the welfare economics literature, people seem to gravitate around the notion of authentic preferences or ideal preferences. I'm not sure we have a clear concept, and certainly we have no clear recipe to elicit such preferences. But let me just give you a thought about it. So when we started working on happiness data, we were thinking perhaps the satisfaction surveys are interesting in this respect because they are a sort of exposed analysis of people's situation by themselves. They look back at their situation and they say, yeah, I think I'm satisfied. So that might be closer to authentic preferences, because at least some of the biases that occur in behavior, in decision, and so decision utility is driven by many illusions and so on. So at least part of these things disappear when you ask them to look back at their situation and evaluate whether they are satisfied or not. Then they are somehow exposed, and the mistakes, predictions, the wrong predictions they've made about the impact of certain decisions have been revealed by their actual situation. So perhaps this third source of data is closer to authentic preferences than observed behavior. I don't know about stated preferences. For stated preferences or discrete choice experiment and that sort of thing, it's a bit harder. It might be a bit in between, because there people are asked to consider scenarios, and so it's a bit like a prediction. So decision utility might play a role here rather than experience utility. But it probably depends a lot on the conditions in which we put people to answer these questions. So if I just come to you and say, you have 10 seconds to tell me how much you would be willing to pay for a better health, it may be hard to answer, but we could imagine putting people in better situations, making them think hard about what matters to them in their life, spending a few minutes, not just a few seconds, on these issues, and perhaps that's a good way. So when you look at the average response time of satisfaction questions, it's a few seconds. It's usually 12 seconds or something like that. That's very short. So that's a bit worrisome, because it means that people give an overall evaluation of their whole life in 12 seconds. They give you a number. So if perhaps what is good about stated preferences is that really we can make sure that we have more time, and we can put people in good conditions to think hard about these things. Actually, I think we should do the same with satisfaction surveys. We shouldn't ask the question like that. Between 0 and 10, where do you stand? We should ask people to think hard about their life, the various dimensions, and you probably agree with that, right? That we should put people in better conditions to make an evaluation of their life.
Okay. ¿Alguna pregunta más? Sí.
Guillem Lopez from Pompeu Fabra University. Mark, this is a very inspiring conference, and I have plenty of questions, but I would like to hear about your views on a couple of things. First, whether you have view the analysis from an optimal taxation point of view. New optimal taxation, efficiency and equity there, and healthcare is a commodity that goes into the budget of different individuals in different ways. You take an isoelastic and you put Samuelson type of choices. Because I think this could be a promising view, because to tax or to subsidy commodities is something well known in welfare economics. The second thing is whether you have a view on the fair innings hypothesis of Alan Williams, whether there is a minimum amount of things that cannot be traded off, because this is your fair share in your life. And the last thing is you have taken some data from OECD on total health expenditure, and I wonder whether it wouldn't be more sensitive to use just public health expenditure per capita, not total, because the rationality is different. And just a final remark, because I was aware that Borch, Spaun, and some other people, Ludwig, have talked again about payroll taxes as a way of indirectly to introduce willingness to pay, in the sense that if it is a payroll tax, is a sort of earmark tax, and you may have a view on the internal rate of return that you get from Social Security contribution, and that's a good argument for preventive, for self-care, and to be a bit more aware about what you do with your own health in the trade-off between income and health. Well, too many things that perhaps I should go into the speaker's corner if you don't have time to answer all that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will perhaps leave the last two questions because I would like to ask you further details about them for later conversation. And let me speak a bit about the first 2 points. So the optimal taxation approach, I think you're right. It's exactly what should be done. So once we have, so the setting is that we have health expenditures which are indirectly organized through the public system. Indeed, the ideal thing would be to look at the impact of the rules of reimbursement and management of the access to health care on the social welfare, and taking account of the incentives impacts, right? So that would be exactly the way to go in order to do it properly. That is, but I mean, we need a lot of ingredients to do that, right? So we need not just the social welfare function, we need to have the right description of incentives, which is not so easy in the case of health, because we have the moral hazard problem through the medical profession. So there is a lot of, there's a complex nexus of incentive effects in the health system. And we have this difficulty of evaluating the productivity of the health system, I mean the health impact of the health system on a given population. So that's a lot of things to do, but that would be, but certainly that would be the ideal route to go. I fully agree with that. I've done some exploratory work on optimal taxation of income, not with health in the picture, and indeed, it's interesting to look at what is attractive is that you can refine, when you have these sort of utility functions which rely on, they are more resourcist, if you want, when you rely on these equivalent income stories. It's more closely connected to fairness principles having to do with looking at people's resources. And so that produces a different outlook of the problem of optimal taxation compared to the traditional one where you have utility functions which are usually not fully specified or come from other sources. So that is an interesting, so it's not just that this tool is good, it's also that it's interesting to look at the impact of the social welfare function you use on the optimal policy that you obtain. And so the kind of ideal paper that I'd like to do in this field, if we had more data and a better understanding of all the determinants, is a paper that starts with the values, where essentially the policymakers can say, I believe in this or that value. And then you say, if that's your belief, then you have this social welfare criteria. Now let me maximize this social welfare criteria. I tell you the optimal policy would be this or that. Right? That would be the sort of ideal paper in public finance. And you could show the sensitiveness of the optimal policy to various values. On the fair earnings question, yes, so indeed, the key question here is what is the relevant description of people's situation? Is it just a snapshot of their life, or is it their whole lifetime? So I guess for an economist, the natural answer is to say probably the whole lifetime. That's the intertemporal, full intertemporal, the life cycle perspective is probably the better one. Some other people, like philosophers, say perhaps it's not totally clear that people are so integrated there. Their personality might be a bit split between various stages of their life. So perhaps it's also worth looking at periods of life which are, for instance, like decades or things like that. But suppose we go for the lifetime perspective, which is my natural inclination. Then indeed we would very quickly see that, for instance, death is just a shortening of life, right? That's something that we all know. But and so of course it is less of a problem if it happens toward the end of your life, because the shortening is less than if it happens in the beginning. So the fair earnings story comes very naturally in this perspective. And so we could look at people's and actually in the survey that we have done with a group in France with Eric, we have asked people questions about their perspectives on their longevity and trade-offs they would be willing to make between their standards of living over their whole future life and their longevity. So we are still in the process of looking at the data and the outcomes, but we should be able to say something about people's willingness to trade off longevity versus their standard of living over a long period of time. And that should go in the direction of potentially the fair innings perspective. Not so much in terms of there is a threshold. If you are beyond the threshold, we no longer care about you. So it would not be that extreme, but something that would indeed be looking at the lifetime perspective, and so the health and the living standard that you enjoyed in your previous life is part of the story. And so what we will do when we look at the future will take account of what happened in the past.
Okay. Thank you very much. Eric, I think you have a lot to do in 20 minutes. But so I'm afraid time is running out and we have to stop here. Remember that we have this speaker corner activity at 3:30. Anyone who wants to join us are welcome. Up to 15 people is the maximum, I think. There is another speaker corner for Gavin Roberts, which I will also ask you to participate if you are interested in that. Thank you for your participation, and many thanks again, Mark Fleurby, for this fascinating session. Thank you.